Hey everybody, this is Dan, coming at you solo for another little Ano-Mini. Thinking I'm going to do a few of these as a Christmas present to all you folks who've been tuning in so dutifully to our main podcast. And also, this gives me an opportunity to talk about some things that I've watched, read, listened to, or experienced without Ron. Some stuff that's not quite as easy to uh, digest, take in as a group. And so today I'm going to talk about some comic books that I have read before. I read them about 10 years ago when I was in college, but I reread all of them today. And of course, I am talking, as you can tell from the background here, about the legendary Alan Moore run on the comic book Miracleman, also known as Marvelman in the UK, where it started. Marvelman or Miracleman, although I guess we're talking about Marvelman here because I'm going to go over the publication history of this a little bit because it's got one of the stranger, more complicated publication histories in the history of comic books. So, Marvelman started out as a serial in the now very long defunct British comics anthology Warrior, or Warrior magazine as it's sometimes called. Warrior was set up kind of like how a lot of comics anthologies in the UK are set up, including the famous 2000 AD and Marvel Superheroes UK. Even the reprints of the Transformers comic in the UK kind of worked like this, where you have a weekly publication schedule and a lot of 6 to 8 page serials contained in each of these. This contributes to, I think, the distinctive quality of a lot of British comics as having a lot more text in them than US or Japanese comics. And this comes down to, of course, the limited amount of space in which you can tell the story each week. They're sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum from manga in that regard, because manga usually you have one person writing and drawing the entire comic. It's fairly uncommon in manga to have a separate writer and illustrator, as is far more common in the United States and in the UK. And in manga, they're usually expected to come out with 14 to 20 pages per week, which lends itself to a lot of dynamic action sequences, less dialogue because the weekly or monthly publications are usually about the size of phone books. They're black and white, so there's less work that needs to be done on them. And that's just a lot of comics for one person to push out on a weekly basis and maintain quality standards. In terms of US creators who worked on that kind of schedule, the only one I can think of is Jack Kirby and to some extent Stan Lee during the original 10-year run of, when they were kind of creating what we now know as the Marvel Comics universe. There's a story that supposedly Jack Kirby actually drew an entire 24-page issue of the X-Men in a weekend, which I can believe because he was drawing about 6 to 8 comic books per month for about 10 years. So he could probably do the stuff in his sleep, and somehow it would turn out great. So with British comics, however, you only have 6 to 8 pages. You have a separate writer and illustrator. It frees up the illustrator to do more, I think, if there's a lot of caption-heavy text without a huge number of instructions, which is also the case with the famed Marvel method. Stan Lee would work out a rough outline of what was going to happen in every issue of the 8 initial Marvel titles, starting with the Marvel's A being called Marvel, because for a long time they were called Timely Atlas, and their re-entry into the superhero comics market, because for a long time they were primarily, almost exclusively, doing Western comics, romance comics, things that were kind of like Archie, for instance, Patsy and Hetty, because that's what was selling, until the Silver Age of Comics begins with Showcase. I forget the exact name, but it's the issue where you have the first appearance of the Barry Allen Flash, and of course Fantastic Four #1. Suddenly superhero comics become huge. They come to dominate the vast majority of the U.S. comics market, and make inroads in the larger international comics market. And an enormous number of these comic books are produced between 1963 or so and 1980, where our story with Marvelman sort of begins. So when superhero comics fell largely out of favor in the 1950s in the United States, I believe the only 3 titles that were still being produced, if there were even 3, were Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. I can't remember if Wonder Woman was still in publication, but I know Batman and Superman still had titles going. I believe the self-titled Superman and Action Comics were both in production throughout that entire period, but everything else was not in production. That's why they had to explain Captain America being trapped in a block of ice to bring him back in the Avengers, because he just hadn't shown up in any comic books for a long time. And in creating this massive trove of comic books, they created one of the cornerstones of international pop culture, namely the superhero. Most of the superhero tropes that we know of, they appear first during the Second World War, but they don't really get the cultural ubiquity and traction that they have now until the 60s, when Jack Kirby, primarily, but also Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and a number of artists at DC start producing these large quantities of comic books to a large audience. And so in the early 1980s, late 1970s, a new wave of comic book writers and artists emerge who grew up with these superhero comics. They're coming into their own. Their teenage years and childhood were colored a lot by the counterculture of the late 60s, drug culture, and in the early 80s, obviously, you have the Cold War going on. You have a lot of talk about the possibility of nuclear war, and you also have postmodernism coming into its own. So, postmodernism obviously being defined in a lot of ways by going back to seemingly disposable cultural artifacts. In the case of like Michel Foucault in his books, you'll see him reference everything from advertisements to building plans, and most importantly, there's this emphasis on the idea of hidden histories, of unintended subtexts to popular culture. You're also dealing with, along with, superheroes are a large part of this, but you also have television. You have the second generation of television viewers. Television is still new enough where it doesn't seem like a thing to be taken for granted. At the same time, you have these people who have grown up for the vast majority of their lives, possibly all of their lives, knowing television as this massive, massive force and also a number of other means of mass communication have become ubiquitous to the point where the high-low culture divide that was so prevalent throughout the early 20th century and the 19th century, this idea of high culture that is worth examination and low disposable culture that is considered kind of mindless entertainment, comes crashing down because the fact is that the stuff considered low culture was and is vastly more popular than the stuff that was considered high culture. A lot of what was considered high culture was determined by the tastes and habits of the extremely wealthy in the 18th and 19th century, but that's a whole other video and subject. So that was a long way to go to get to Marvel Man. So Alan Moore gets kicked out of high school for selling LSD because I believe he read a book by Timothy Leary and he thought it was his sort of social duty to sell LSD. He gets kicked out. The headmaster of his school says basically, you're never going to go to college, or at least what we would call college here in the States. And so he's stuck with two options. He either is going to make it as a writer, or he's going to be stuck working shitty construction jobs for the rest of his life. Luckily for all of us, he made it as a writer. And his earliest work before Marvel Man, because Marvel Man is definitely in the earliest phase of his work, he does a lot of different kinds of things. He's writing little fill-in stories for 2000 AD called Tharg's Future Shocks, which are just short, sort of, imagine like a Twilight Zone episode in 3 pages. He's writing Skiz and Halo Jones and DR and Quinch, which are all serials in 2000 AD. And in these serials, he's still kind of figuring out his style. I would say the best out of the 3 of them is definitely The Ballad of Halo Jones, which was not completed. It was supposed to be 9 books long, and by books I mean basically, so when something would get serialized in 2000 AD, you'd have all these 8-page chapters, I guess, adding up to usually something in the range of 100 to 150 pages that would then be released as a paperback book. And so 3 of these were released, and eventually an oversized version was released many years later in the United States and in the UK by Titan Books, called The Complete Ballad of Halo Jones. It's a great edition of it. It looks great. It's oversized, which is true to the original size of the comic books, because in the UK, usually comic books are going to be sold in like tabloid-sized magazines versus the standard U.S. comic layout, which these would be. And so he kind of starts realizing that he has this talent for reimagining genre fiction. And being in the comics industry and needing to make a living, because he was not tremendously famous until he got he got hired to write Swamp Thing for DC in the U.S., at which point he became kind of an overnight comics celebrity. He went on to make Watchmen, obviously, and he became, probably as close to a household name as somebody who writes comic books who is not Stan Lee can or could be. And so the kind of golden era of these revisionist works of fiction that Moore produced begins with his work with Warrior magazine and his encounters with excuse me, editor Des Skin. And he begins 2 serials in the first issue of Warrior magazine, which I don't have, or else I would, have it on the little display case, otherwise known as my window back there. One of them is V for Vendetta. with David Lloyd, and the other one is Miracleman, which begins. The first few chapters are illustrated by Gary Leach, and then it goes through a number of illustrators, including Alan Davis, Rick Veitch, and Chuck Austin, before the final of the three books that Moore projected his story to be in and that were completed is drawn entirely by John Totleman, who he worked with extensively on Swamp Thing. So Marvel Man is noteworthy for being quite possibly the first revisionist superhero comic book. You have precedents to this, but they're largely outside of the superhero comic genre, and they're more focused within humor comics, and particularly Harvey Kurtzman's run on Mad Magazine in the 1950s. The first 26 issues of Mad when it was a comic book, and then the 27th and 28th issues where it becomes a magazine, and remained a magazine until it was canceled for good, I believe about a year ago. But Harvey Kurtzman is only working there for the first 28 issues, and in those first 28 issues, he, as Art Spiegelman put it, says pop culture is lying to you, the media is lying to you, and we are the media. There's some of the most subversive satire produced in the United States in the entirety of the 20th century in those comics, and they had an unbelievable influence and impact on everybody from Robert Crumb to, of course, Alan Moore. So when Moore gets handed this assignment to revive this Silver Age knockoff of Captain Marvel by C.C. Beck, which Captain Marvel by C.C. Beck, although they're fun comic books, and I'm not trying to diminish them in any way, but it's clearly a knockoff of Superman. And Des Skin starts Warrior Magazine. He gets the rights from Mick Anglo to make new Marvel Man comics, and hands this project over to Alan Moore, who, having studied Friedrich Nietzsche in a variety of unusual texts in philosophy, theology, and history, decides that he's going to finish the project that Harvey Kurtzman started in the 50s and completely deconstruct the superhero mythology. And I believe that Miracleman was probably his best attempt at doing this, because he did, that was kind of his calling card for a long time, right? Because, like, to some extent, V for Vendetta is not exactly a deconstruction of superhero comics, but it is very much a revisionist superhero comic. Watchmen, obviously, is completely devoted to this Kurtzman-esque deconstruction of the idea of superheroes and why we value them so much in both US and UK pop culture. And he sets off this wave of these revisionist comics that continue to this day. And it's worth noting that most things that resemble superhero comics that were not reprints that have run outside of the United States don't tend to take the superhero construct very seriously. The serial that made 2000 AD so famous and is still probably the best known feature to ever run in 2000 AD and runs in 2000 AD to this day, Judge Dredd, reads largely as a very over-the-top satire of U.S. authoritarian impulses and cultural excesses. And so, in Marvel Man, without the minimal restrictions imposed by 2000 AD, Moore can do literally anything he wants. He has the sandbox of ridiculous 50s superheroes, and he just goes whole hog. And we open the story with 8 pages of original Marvel Man comics from the 1950s. There's a final page that takes some cues from both Roy Lichtenstein and also manages to basically imply that this entire sequence is a dream. We see Mike Moran, who we later find out is in fact Miracle Man. From here on out, I'm just going to call him Miracle Man. We find out that he has forgotten that he's Miracle Man for 20 years, but he keeps having these dreams that he's a superhero flying around with this makeshift family of other people dressed up in matching ridiculous costumes. He's not making much of a living. He's living in Thatcher's England. There's numerous references to Margaret Thatcher throughout the text. And he's working as a part-time journalist on a journalism assignment. He ends up getting kidnapped by terrorists who have stolen plutonium. We know we're in the 1980s. We know we're in the middle of the Cold War as soon as that turns out to be the case. And he sees part of a warning sticker in a mirror and realizes that he remembers basically that he's Miracle Man. He remembers that, like Captain Marvel says Shazam, and he goes from being this little kid to being Captain Marvel. He says the word atomic backwards, Kamota, and he becomes this godlike, incredibly powerful being that's nearly invulnerable. And he says this, he takes out the terrorists, and realizes, like, most of his life as he understood it at the beginning of the series is a lie. He goes back to tell his wife that he is in fact Miracle Man. No one in England remembers who Miracle Man is, and we find out why that is later. And from then on, the book only gets, I think, more profound and also more wild and incredibly unusual by the standards of superhero comics, especially in the late 1970s, early 80s. We find out that Miracle Man, Kid Miracle Man, who is sort of his sidekick, is still alive, and Kid Miracle Man, who is now an adult and runs an incredibly successful corporation, contacts him. They catch up, and then it turns out, of course, the Kid Miracle Man is completely evil and insane. Basically is testing to see if Mike Moran / Miracle Man poses some kind of threat to his ability to just sort of take what he wants and lead the kind of life he wants to live. And they end up in a giant battle. Eventually, Miracle Man gets Johnny Bates, aka Kid Miracle Man, to say the word that transforms him back into Johnny Bates, who is his human form. We find out the difference between the human form and the superhero form later in how that works exactly. Uses a thing called the infraspace later in the series. And he's turned into this little kid who has psychological symptoms both of antisocial personality disorder and I don't want to say schizophrenia, but he basically, like, he has this very very real looking, very tangible feeling version of Kid Miracle Man in his head that kind of acts like his id. It's constantly telling him to do bad things. And of course, if he says the magic word that turns him back into Kid Miracleman, he will have plenty of power to do those awful things. Miracleman, aka Mike Moran, is contacted, or more accurately, chased by a government agent named Evelyn Cream. Cream realizes what he has on his hands and starts playing games with the UK governments, and takes Miracleman out to the jungle in order to find out the truth of his origins. And this is when the comic starts to get very, very interesting. It turns out that Miracleman is the product of a series of Nazi-era experiments by a scientist who, I forget what the equivalent of this in the UK was, but in the US it was called Operation Paperclip. Basically, were a bunch of Nazi scientists who were desired for their skills and abilities by the US government were given new identities and sent to the United States. There was some similar program, I believe, in the UK. You should look that up if you're not familiar, because it was one of the more shameful chapters in 20th century history as regards the West, and kind of undercuts a lot of the more propagandistic representations of the United States relationship to the Nazi regime, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So it turns out a scientist named Dr. Gargunza, who is very clearly a sociopath, psychopath, who has dreams of living forever, starts these experiments on kidnapped orphans to create. First, he clones them to create the perfect version of them, and then he creates a way for them to switch out between this perfect body with all the superpowers and their human body in a thing called the infraspace. So they say the magic word, and one form or the other ends up in the infraspace. And he is conducting these experiments in the hopes that he can get two of them to have a child, because it turns out there's an age limit on how old a person can be to be subject to these experiments. Otherwise, he would have given himself the superpowers. But his desire is to basically put an imprint of his mind into the child of two of these people, so that he can live forever. He keeps conducting these very Nazi-style experiments. He has Miracleman, Kid Miracleman, and young Miracleman. They're all strapped into chairs. He's feeding them dreams that look exactly like Golden Age superhero comic books. They're kind of ridiculous. And he's constantly feeding them these dreams, so that they basically is a form of mind control. And so Dr. Gargunza in the narrative is sort of he's the unconscious desire to manipulate that exists in these pop cultural hero stories. And I would argue that continues, that's always kind of been a part of superhero comics, is that they are manipulative fantasy, the same way that romance novels are manipulative fantasy, or sci-fi hero stories, or adventure movies where you get to imagine that you're wrong, so that suddenly the rules of morality go out the window, and then you can go around with a machine gun gunning down anybody and everybody. So Miracleman is obviously pissed off when he finds out that his entire past was a lie and he was being manipulated by this Nazi scientist. His wife, Liz Moran, is kidnapped around the time that he's looking through this abandoned bunker with all these records of these experiments. And he ends up having to go track down Dr. Gargunza. He tracks Gargunza down. We have an issue-long thing of Gargunza giving us this, his kind of autobiography. He's doing the classic, like, villain tells his life story as a way of explaining his evil plot thing. Except it's a much more extreme and disturbing story, obviously, than we usually get in these things, right? Like in, I don't know, in Batman, Mr. Freeze, he loses his wife, and he's trying to do all these crimes so that he can keep his wife frozen until there's a cure for her illness, and so he's sort of sympathetic. Gargunza is not sympathetic in the least. He basically grows up in South America. He's kind of roped into this drug gang, and he describes rather graphically how he takes over the drug gang, and when he does take over the drug gang, he has the guy who's technically above him in the hierarchy viciously murdered, and then he's like raping his girlfriend in front of him, and it's just ugly stuff. He goes, he meets Martin Heidegger. Alan Moore was ahead of the curve on the whole Heidegger being a Nazi thing, as we found out from the Heidegger Black Book journals that came out. He was a pretty unapologetic Nazi, and also, weirdly enough, one of the major figures in creating what became the postmodernist movement, which there's a whole, I mean, that's a whole other can of worms, basically, the weird linkages between leftist liberation movements and ideology and theory, and kind of roots of postmodernism that exist in Nazism. Paul de Man, who was another person with Nazi ties, was a teacher and huge influence on Jacques Derrida. And that's a whole, I could go on about that for hours. But anyway, so Miracleman shows up. He is chased by Miracle Dog, who is this horrifying looking thing that doesn't even really resemble a dog very much. He gets 2 of his fingers bitten off, and he basically, due to the fact that his Mike Moran persona is so physically damaged, from this point on in the story, he becomes Mike Moran once or twice more, but he pretty much becomes Miracleman 100% of the time. He kills Dr. Gargunza, he kills Dr. Gargunza's guards, he kills Miracle Dog, and then he pretty much, he's just sort of rediscovering his origins, and it's at this point in the narrative that so Warrior magazine went out of business halfway through the publication of Marvel Man and V for Vendetta. When Alan Moore became incredibly famous in the United States later in the 1980s, he was offered the opportunity to finish both comic books. V for Vendetta was finished by DC Comics, and Miracleman, which had to be retitled Miracleman at this point because Marvel Comics was going to sue otherwise, was taken over by Eclipse Comics, which the Eclipse issues are the ones that I put behind my head here. And at this point in the story, the chapters stop being 6 to 8 pages. They're usually like 17 to 20 page comic books, which is more in line with, of course, the U.S. publication of comic books. They're colorized. The original Warrior versions were not in color. And the color job and the lettering job that Eclipse does is, it gets the job done, but it's iffy. And I'll talk a bit about the remastering later. So, at this point, we meet So it turns out that Liz Moran is pregnant. We have probably the first depiction of live childbirth in comic books in Miracleman #9. It's fairly graphic, but also handled fairly tastefully. You could tell that Moore definitely had some thoughts about his own kids, and it's a heartwarming issue. It's one of the warmer moments in what is otherwise a fairly bleak and uncompromising view of baby. You can tell that Moore, on some level, the ways that Miracle Man feels manipulated by these dreams that he had implanted in his head. Moore feels betrayed by the superhero comics that he was fed as a child, and wants to go back and kind of discover the underlying tensions and subconscious, I guess, for lack of a better word, ideologies driving them. And so, like a lot of postmodern narratives, there's a search for the truth that leads to basically more questions. And there's the author kind of. I mean, I guess this is true of like all fiction. Like the author, some part of the author is going to show up in the fictional creations. There's going to be some element of the text that is kind of self-referential to the creation of the text, um, and you have a lot of like heavy prose captions. There's numerous issues of this series where there's barely any dialogue. It's just sort of these very lush illustrations being done with a lot of narrative captions over the course of the issue. It's a very condensed story, but and I'll get to the style of the comics a little bit later. So at this point, uh, Liz Moran has the Miracle Baby. The Miracle Baby, as we find out later, names itself Winter, and is a very strange baby. It seems to be eating adult food within 3 days of being born. It has these incredible powers. Later, it turns out that it can talk at 6 weeks old and is, in fact, smarter than Miracle Man. Uh, in the next issue, we meet Miracle Woman, and we find out that on top of the secret hidden experiments that Dr. Gargunza was doing on the behalf of the UK government to create their kind of answer to the atomic bomb in the form of these superhuman uh, science experiments, I suppose. Uh, we find out that he was doing another set of experiments secretly on top of the ones that are discussed in the second book of the series, which was initially published as the Red King Syndrome when it was collected in a trade paperback. We find out that two other subjects, including, God, I can't remember her first name is, but anyway, a Miracle Woman. Miracle Woman shows up, and also the aliens who Dr. Gargunza stole the technology from to create the Miracle Man project, known as Project Zarathustra, in reference to the Nietzsche novel, I guess you would call it, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Uh, she mentions, she kind of describes her origin story. We're given a fairly similar origin story to what Miracle Man discovers when he goes to Gargunza's lab. But again, we're peeling back another layer of an onion. It turns out that Gargunza was essentially raping this young woman while she was being fed these dreams about flying. And there's a huge number of cultural references throughout this piece. My phone is about to die, so we'll continue.